with us tonight Rich McGuinness, who is kind of a mouthful, the Deputy Director for Climate Change and Environmental Planning for the BPDA. And obviously this is a topic of great interest to all of us, so we're very happy to have you here tonight. We're very interested.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a new title. I've been a waterfront planner for the Boston Planning Development Agency for 17 years. Before that, I was Executive Secretary of the Boston Conservation Commission, and before that, I worked at the Attorney General's office as a litigation assistant on environmental protection cases. So the new title, new subsection of the planning department where we're focused on climate change. So I have several architects and planners working with me on implementing Climate Ready Boston. Climate Ready Boston is a report that the city put out 2 years ago that prepares the city for the impacts of climate change. And I think the most important message is that it's happening now. And many of you probably witnessed it through the storms in January and March. What's great about Climate Ready Boston is that there's consensus, particularly in City Hall. There's been mapping of sea level rise probably for the last 8 or 9 years with different modeling, different methodology. We've used the most accurate methodology, actually utilizing what MassDOT is using for flood risk models. So we're on the same kind of flood risk path as MassDOT is, which makes sense because we want to make sure we're preparing the city and that our roadways and subways aren't impacted getting in and out of the city. So Climate Ready Boston is good in that it's got the right numbers for what we should plan and predict for sea level rise. It's probably the biggest concern for this neighborhood. We are looking at sea level rise up to 9 inches by 2030, 21 inches by 2050, and possibly up to 40 inches by 2070. And we've taken a conservative approach. So if there's global work to reduce emissions and carbon, it may not be as great, but by 2070, we decided to go for the higher number for planning purposes of what to plan for. If you go to our webpage, there is a map where we've mapped out the 40-inch floodplain for the city of Boston. It actually looks like, if you look at it, you can see the original Shaman Peninsula. You can see the islands in East Boston. Most of this is landfill. In Climate Ready Boston, there's some tasks that the BPDA has been asked to deliver. And one is flood defense overlay districts. So flood defense overlay district is where you look at a neighborhood, you look at where the flood waters are going to come in at what time. Is it 2030? Is it 2050? Is it 2070? And how can you modify the shoreline? Ways you can protect neighborhoods is to elevate, protect, or relocate. So we're looking at elevation and protection in these flood defense overlay districts. So there would act or be integrated into our plans for neighborhoods. So where neighborhood plans has locations for streets and parks and other public realm, these flood defense mechanisms would be included. And flood defense mechanism could be a hard wall, just elevating seawalls, or they could be a vegetated berm. So you could integrate new open space with berms or parklands or other things. That's one of the things underway. As a planner, the two tools that we're relying on is accurate modeling, which I believe we have, and the other is just messaging. And when you look at these maps, they're apocalyptic, they're overwhelming, and we want to dissipate the community's concerns because there are ways to protect Boston. It's been done in Europe for centuries, and it's been updated elsewhere throughout the world with modern technologies to protect cities. So one thing that the BPDA is looking at is implementing flood protection overlay districts. Another is looking at this future floodplain. So if you look at the 40-inch map, which is pretty much hitting every neighborhood in the city near Boston Harbour, start adding zoning to that. And one zoning thing that we could add to that is redefining the definition of height. Right now, building height is measured from grade to the highest structural element of the top floor. If we modify that definition from the future design flood elevation, we'd give people a little bit more room, probably 3 to 4 feet to work with elevating their buildings. But there are other things we want to add into that. There'll be a public process involved. We're really just trying to figure out what to put into this plan. Some other things in Boston are all these different kind of levels of defense. So going out, I guess, to the most dramatic is an outer harbor barrier that's under study right now. We sit on the design team. It's being managed by UMass Boston, and that's where they're looking at linking the harbor islands, the outer harbor islands, with the wall to protect storm surge from coming into the city and flooding. They're looking at the outer harbor islands, but inner harbor just connecting Logan Airport to Castle Island. So two different strategies. In the cost-benefit analysis, they're looking at, well, gee, if we walled off the ocean from Boston Harbor, will we change the salinity? Will we change the habitat, the temperature? How do we deal with navigation? Because we've got a very active port with containers and fuel coming in and out. So all of those things are under consideration. But it's going to be very expensive. How do we bankroll something like that? And what is it needed? So all these things will be coming out in the study probably this summer. So that would address storm surge, but not tidal fluctuations. So if you add 40 inches of sea level rise, you'll have daily flooding at high tide in major parts of the city, including the South Boston waterfront. And an outer harbor barrier will not solve that problem. What it would do is protect the city from 100-year storm surge throughout the city, but not tidal fluctuations. So you deal with tidal fluctuations with looking at the specific neighborhood and the contours of that neighborhood and how to retrofit the shoreline to protect that neighborhood. We've done a study for East Boston that was finished in the fall, and we're wrapping up a study in the South Boston waterfront. We picked those two neighborhoods because their flood paths, there's a greater area and greater population currently at risk for flooding. But what we're learning is from all of those efforts are tools to apply to all neighborhoods. The next neighborhood we're going to look at is North End in downtown Boston. So we're going to look from the Charles River Dam all the way to the Four Point Channel. So that's our next planning exercise. This is being led by the Environment Department. Austin Blackman, the Chief of Environmental Services, I believe, you wrote him a letter asking them to start this planning process. So they'll have more details on that shortly. But we are picking up useful information from both of those studies that will be applied throughout the city. So what are these mechanisms? How are they engineered? How do you develop the right-of-way, since most of the water's edge is privately held? How does the government come in? If the government's going to do these things, secure the right-of-way and build this infrastructure, how can they be permitted? Some of the things that we're proposing in East Boston is actually filling Boston Harbor, so creating more land, but at a higher elevation, and creating more open space, estuaries, salt marsh. But the Army Corps of Engineers really doesn't like you filling coastal waters. So these are things that we're trying to tackle because we believe that the public value of these structures should outweigh filling of Boston Harbor and modifying existing habitat. Other things we're looking at is funding. Well, how do we fund these types of things? What are the strategies? There's a FEMA pre-disaster grant program, but you have to be in a current floodplain and have to have undergone significant flooding. But those are things that we can look at. We're looking at grant opportunities, partnerships with philanthropic organizations. If we're creating new parkland, is there an ability to get private funds to build these things? While they'll look like parkland, they'll also protect the neighborhoods from flooding. So these are all tools that we're adding to our, I guess, planning toolbox, something different from what we've used in the past. We're also looking at regulations, state regulations. So Chapter 91, you're probably familiar with the state law that allowed filling of Boston Harbor. We use it as a tool to implement Harbor Walk. It acts like zoning, but the state licensed landfilling and seawalls, and those licenses are for the life of the landfill, and the property owners are required to maintain that fill But if you make the case that with sea level rise, that fill is at risk for flooding, is there an emphasis on the property owner to start elevating their seawalls or other things? So we're looking at many different mechanisms for flood protection. We're also partnering with the Boston Society of Architects on retrofitting buildings. That's where our greatest vulnerability is. You see all the new developments happening in South Boston. Those developments are well elevated, but they're islands of resiliency. The roadways getting to them will be flooded, but our historic buildings, people love Boston because we're authentic. We've got great historic buildings, but they really weren't designed in consideration of sea level rise. So we want to partner with Boston Society of Architects to come up with systems to retrofit buildings, to dry-proof buildings. So the wharves out along the north end, Commercial Wharf, Lewis Wharf, Union Wharf, can you modify those buildings without altering their kind of aesthetic appeal to protect them from flooding? New York has a great set of guidelines that they put out this year that we're looking at. They've got a ton of brownstones, so they've got some guidance on retrofitting buildings. And then your usual suggestions, including moving your mechanicals at the upper floor, and making sure that there's no valuable materials or mechanicals in your basement, that your emergency systems would work during a flood. So that's what we're up to. The East Boston reports online, both in the BPDA webpage, but also the City of Boston's Environment Department. The South Boston plan should be available probably by early summer, and then the city's going to get going forward with downtown North End and also Dorchester. Dorchester is another flood path into the city. So that's what we're up to. It's sort of new territory for all of us. I guess we know where the existing flood plains are. We've always known that, but really never did anything about it. Now we're looking at where the future floodplains are, and knowing that buildings could last 50 to 100 years, where we could have higher sea level rise, we want to make sure our built environment is protected. Climate Ready Boston is being integrated into all major city plans, including Imagine Boston, which is the city's new master plan that went out last summer. That's the framework for how the city can responsibly grow. We've got some growth zones in the city. Suffolk Downs, you may have read up on the plans for Suffolk Downs. Whitehead Circle, some property in Alston, Brighton, but Whitehead Circle and Suffolk Downs are in a future floodplain. So how can we responsibly suggest new development there, knowing that it could be flooded in the future? So we're looking at ways to modify those future neighborhoods. The developer for Suffolk Downs, we met with them several times and told them, either you have to contribute to a district scale solution, which we don't know what that is, or you're going to have to elevate the entire site by 40 inches. They're going to elevate the entire site by 40 inches to make that development protected from future sea level rise. So those are the things that we're looking into. We updated Article 37, our green building zoning last fall. It has a checklist, so developments that trigger Article 80 large project review, so bigger than 50,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet in Harbour Park zoning along the water's edge of the north end. That projects have to complete a checklist, and in that checklist, they now have to demonstrate how their buildings will be protected, not just from current flood risks, but future flood risks. So that's a tool that we have. But eventually, things are going to be less voluntary under Article 37 and more of a requirement as we start picking up good best management practices on building protections. I think that's it. I want to talk a little bit about ferries too. We hope to have a ferry dock at Lovejoy Wharf up by the end of the summer with a service running from Lovejoy Wharf to Fan Pier that'll be funded by the businesses in South Boston Waterfront and Mascot. And also Winthrop will be running a ferry. They funded a 3-year pilot. This will be their 3rd year. They'll now be stopping at the South Pier at New England Aquarium. and also making a stop at Fan Pier. I'm not sure exactly what the cycle is, but there may be an opportunity for you to get to South Boston Waterfront without having to cross the 4-point channel on that ferry service. And hopefully more ferry service to come, because it's a really affordable way of getting people around the city. East Boston, there is a dock proposed for Lewis Mall. So that's in between the Portside project and the Clipper Ship project. We filed an FTA grant last fall for $1.6 million to build a dock, because we see a lot of opportunities from North Station to East Boston, but also the Fan Pier, South Boston.
So that's in the works?
That's in the works. Hopefully we get a grant, and I think it'll happen organically right away, because there's a lot of demand now. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, actually, I do have one. Sean Sanger. Is Boston Water and Sewer involved in your discussions? I noticed just this is probably short-term as opposed to long-term, but some of the flooding that's in the neighborhood going on right now is actually water back charging up through their drains, and it's not like it's water creeping in, but it's actually coming up through. So I'm just curious how that kind of fits into the discussion as well.
We are involved in the discussion, but they've been more focused on extreme precipitation and inland flooding, but now are focusing on coastal flooding. And if you saw the video clips of what happened in South Boston in the January and March storms, majority of that came through the storm drain systems. So here we are designing these above grade flood defense mechanisms. The assumption is that the drains will be plugged with tide gates. There's one outfall that caused all that flooding in 4 Point, and that was by Mount Washington Street up by Gillette, and it's going to be taken care of this summer.
Yeah, I think that's the same thing that's going on Causeway Street.
Yes.
Near Lovejoy.
Yes.
And Beverly, I believe, over there.
So the Boston Water Sewer is looking at their storm drain systems to make sure that they're floodgates and tide gates. But there's a lot of privately owned storm drains, particularly still on the 4 Point channel, that we have to identify who owns them, where do they go, and how do we plug them up. Another thing is, all this landfill is very porous. So again, even though you might have something above ground, if the water is saturating through the seawalls, it's going through the fill and can come up beyond whatever these solutions we have. So all of these protective measures, we require sheet piling to go below the groundwater level. So that needs to be put in place. So you got to plug the storm drains, put the sheet walls in, plus make elevation changes along the water's edge.
Teresa Paddock, I live in the North Camera. So one of the things that strikes me in the section at Seaport, which I know we're not, it's still the buildings proposed for along the waterfront here, is that it's protecting the buildings, but there is an open space. I know what Suffolk Downs is talking about having the theater and they'll let it flood sometimes and that type of thing. And I was a little surprised that Seaport didn't have a bit more open space so that there would be, more absorption. But along the waterfront here, where people look towards Lewis Walk, and John Shapara wants to build over there, and people look at Sergeant Walk sometimes, whatever. What more will the developers have to do than just protect their own building, but actually deal with the fact that it's becoming denser and denser, and it's only through, I assume, the pipes that the water can go?
Right. What we've seen are these new developments are protected on their own, but the water is still passing around the buildings and getting inland. So in South Boston, we told the owners of Fan Pier and Pier 4, we can modify the streets, we can elevate the streets to protect everybody inland. You'll be on the other side, good luck. It got their attention, they prefer to be inside the protective measurements. So they're very interested in participating, providing the right of way, possibly contributing funds for that. The thing is, with South Boston, we've given all the entitlements away. So we can't go back and ask for more, really. But we've got their attention because they're very concerned about these risks. Providing the easements, perhaps maintenance agreements for what these structures are going to be. But I think every neighborhood's going to be different. The North End has such a different shoreline than South Boston that you may have to have more hardscape we'd like to look at green solutions. There's this thing called the magenta zone in the south or north end downtown Waterfront. I don't know really how it evolved, but it's on the navigational charts, and it means that if you're within a magenta zone, you don't need an Army Corps permit. And maybe we utilize the magenta zone to put in some in-water solutions where we don't have to worry about the federal government shutting it down by saying that you're interfering with Section 404 water quality issues. So these are all the things that we need to troubleshoot. Sydney?
So you've done 3 plans that you talked about, and each of them has had one project that's fairly modest. And I think neighborhoods are a little concerned they're too modest given the flooding that we've seen recently. If you're talking about more plans, and we're sitting in the north end, do you have suggestions for the neighborhood how we ensure that things like stormwater damage and tight, you talked about a checklist for developers, but how do we make it more than a checklist, make it requirements for developers? What can the neighborhood do to ensure that when the North End plan is done, it's not one small, modest proposal or project, it's more than that?
But I think the projects that you're referencing, the roof elevation of Main Street, those are just the beginning, that's not the end. That's what we had within our financial capacity to pay for. By elevating Main Street by the Schraff Center, we're protecting 200 acres of property from being flooded. And then there's a deployable flood wall that's being put in the East Boston Greenway that protects a lot of the residential homes upstream of the East Boston Greenway. And these,
So there'll be more things that come beyond the plan
Yes.
that you're doing?
Yeah. So back to East Boston, the flood path by the East Boston Greenway, the Clippership Wharf development and the portside developments are elevated. So now they're part of the solution just by their elevation. Lewis Mall is a flood path, so we have to put something in Lewis Mall. And then Pierce Park Phase 2, which is under design, just by a simple elevation of 3 feet, we've prevented future flooding for East Boston from that flood path. So that's like underway. But then if you go up towards Border Street and Liberty Plaza, which is another flood path, we don't have the solutions yet. We know what should be done, but not the mechanisms of doing it. And that might be done through a harbor plan or maybe some trade-off with developments for density bonuses. We haven't really sorted those things out. And then for South Boston, a big price tag. We don't control the right-of-way. Other than plugging this one outfall, we really don't have any near-term solutions at the moment.
Can you talk a little bit more about a plan for the north end? So you said from the dam to Fort Point, is it going to be a resiliency study?
So it'll probably follow the same thing that we've done in East Boston and South Boston, where we bring on a team of that can model flood risks, an engineering team, a landscape team, and what they'll look at is where the water's coming at what time. Like the first priority area for South Boston is 4 Point Channel, not along Seaport Boulevard, not along the piers, but 4 Point Channel. So that's where we should have our early on focus. So that's what we would do along North End and downtown is where's the water coming into first? Where is it coming from, period, and then in what areas, and then working with the neighborhood on, we had workshops in both neighborhoods on the solutions. You could have a blunt, hard wall that doesn't, cut you off from the water's edge, or a greener solution, and then looking at what the opportunities are. So it'll be the same process, a public process, workshops, and then a report, and then next steps. And East Boston was sort of a light touch. We talked a little bit about funding, a little bit about the regulations. South Boston goes in much deeper, really pushing DEP, Army Corps, because you're going to have the same challenges in the North End and downtown. So hopefully we'll have, more progress to report and integrate into the report for this neighborhood when that's done.
Does the BPDA run it, or does
So,
CCM, who runs it?
It's run by the Environment Department.
Oh, okay.
But
Austin Blackman's
we're,
group?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, so under Austin's Blackman's group, but we participate, we're kind of like co-managers for the process.
How is the key transportation infrastructure like our subway system and Amtrak, the major rail tracks, how are they integrated into this whole planning process?
So on our advisory committee with MassDOT, this guy Steve Miller sits on our advisory committee, and we're using the same flood projection modeling as MassDOT. So we're kind of preparing for the same risks, the same kind of flood elevations. So MassDOT is looking on their own at protecting the Central Artery project and the portals to the tunnels, and MBTA is doing the same. So that's a concurrent effort underway by the state, but the state is involved in our process since we're utilizing their modeling.
What about the South Station and the Amtrak and the commuter?
I mean, that's all the right-of-way of MassDOT, so that falls under the umbrella of what MassDOT's doing, not really the Amtrak's. So I think Amtrak would benefit from whatever analysis MassDOT is doing. The seawall along the 4-point channel dips about 3 feet as you head south. MassDOT's plans to expand South Station includes elevating that seawall, which would prevent a significant flood path into South Boston, or rather South Bay, Chinatown, and the South End. So those are things that are under study concurrently with our efforts. And then Massport as well has their own modeling and plans to modify their assets from flood risks. Sir.
So can you quantify the extent to which the mitigations that are likely to occur before the early mitigations, like those in East Boston, you mentioned Charleston, South Boston, the impact that those have on storm surge situations on the areas like the North End and Waterfront that have yet to employ any mitigations? Does it make the problem worse?
No, because it's not like a flood inland along a river or a pond where if you fill a marsh or a low-lying area, you're filling flood storage. Coastal storms are different. The coastal water is going to come in. You're not displacing flood waters elsewhere. You want to make sure that these structures aren't designed to modify the velocity of waves and flow. So those are things that we have to be careful about. But there isn't a displacement. So what we're doing in East Boston doesn't mean that there's going to be more flood water. It's just coming in. It's just coming in, and it's going to go wherever it's low, no matter what you do. David?
Dave Kubiak, Cleveland Place. You mentioned that the BRA has given warnings to the developers at Suffolk Downs and the developers at Champier and so forth, that they better protect themselves. But will the BRA, BPDA now, will the BPDA board unanimously approve projects there, or only if they show that they're protecting themselves? Are they on their own? In other words, is there a separation between the city approving development in these high-risk areas and what they do to protect themselves? Or is the BRA going to make sure that they provide the protections needed, including first responders being able to get to these areas, before the board approves these developments? The other question I have is, I've heard that one of the worst flooded areas of downtown was in the area of Long Wharf, and the BRA is now seeking approval from the state for a municipal harbor plan that calls for further development in that very area. And yet now you're saying the Environment Department is going to start this study to determine how to protect that area. How do they mesh, and why is the BRA moving forward with a municipal harbor plan before this protection plan is understood?
So on your first question, these developers have to demonstrate that these buildings will be protected from future flood risks, but we're relying on their architects and engineers to, kind of exhibit how that will happen. We're still in that discovery phase. We don't want to mandate, you will do this to your building, this will be the solution, because we're not sure what works. So it's still the kind of exploratory.
So is there a moratorium on approvals until we figure this out?
No, because we think the engineering firms can sort it, by elevating the entire Suffolk Downs, they've resolved it. However, like you said, what about the roadways that link to it? The Suffolk Downs project is relying heavily on Blue Line service for transit mode. And that Blue Line station, and those Blue Line tracks flooded at both storms. So it's now been pointed to them that, if you're gonna count on the Blue Line to allow this density that you want, you have to work on a solution to protect that station and that track. So there's off-site interventions that would need to occur as well.
But what you're essentially saying is your board will not approve those development projects unless and until they've provided the necessary protections to those areas.
It's under Article 37, it's in the zoning.
We'll see.
Oh, and then you had a question about the downtown waterfront. In the municipal harbor plan, we're recommending that new open space is elevated. So the open space at the Town House Restaurant, the Harbor Walk in between Town House Restaurant, going along State Street, Old Atlantic Avenue, even possibly through Harbor Towers. If that was elevated, that would act as a flood defense mechanism. So there's a whole section in that harbor plan that talks about flooding risks and what can be done to protect the neighborhood from flooding. So we've already had that discussion and ahead of what the city's going to get into.
It talks about those things, but it doesn't show those things. But what it does show is higher density development. It's very clear about the approvals that the BRA will make for higher density development in those very high-risk areas. And yet it only talks about the protections.
So those developments have to provide the city $500,000 to do a next level of planning, including coming up with design solutions for protecting the downtown waterfront. They can't file environmental notification forms until the funds are in place and the planning is underway. So we're providing the entitlements, but they can't act on the entitlements until the plan has been shelved.
So the BRA board will not approve the Geofaro project until those plans are in place?
Yeah, the way it's written, yeah. And the state will integrate into their harbor plans, so there's a firewall from the local level. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Vanesti. Just curious, when you're talking about the berms, is that on existing land and it's not necessarily on the water's edge?
It really depends, on the property. Is there enough room? We're looking at berms along Gillette's property, which range from 20 feet to 40 feet. Yeah, they're going to lose parking from that, but they're also protecting their facility. You could do a wall. They actually have walls that are made of really rigid glass that act like a seawall that you can still see through. So there are different solutions, not one size fits all. But that's what we'd be looking at in the downtown and north end plan. It's just like, what are the, widths of the right-of-ways along the piers, and what could you do? We are looking for some in-water filling as well, if we don't have a lot of room to work with. So we haven't sorted that out, but we should have some things up for South Boston, so the department's website that gives you examples of the different type of things you can do.
It seems like it would be, what land, open land we have left in the north end, it would be good to have those things in place before people start building on it. Would you buy property back in order to do that?
We may have to secure easements, through urban renewal. We've got the ability to do takings, where there are renewal plans. It might be part of a trade-off. But that's one of the one benefit, even though we may not have the funds to build these things, once we have an understanding of where they're located, we want to make sure we're protecting the right of way so that future developments don't interfere with these things. Or if they're occurring, that they're contributing to these solutions.
Hi, my name is Kathy Rushlow. I guess I'm concerned about rumors that I've heard about potential development of hotels or other developments in the neighborhood. And I know you mentioned the 55-foot height restriction in a lot of the areas, and also the requirement that you may maintain closing with a 40-inch raising before the structure begins. But it seems like you're elevating that height limit as opposed to taking away from potential development. So it's actually making the height restriction 55 inches plus 40 inches, 55 feet plus 40 inches, as opposed to taking that 40 inches.
It's not a one-size-fits-all. We're looking at some projects in South Boston along Dorchester Avenue where the zoning is 45 feet. But it is in a future floodplain. The developer wants to make sure that his building is elevated. It's just, we would allow that project to go up 3 to 4 feet. I mean, it'd be modest. Nothing.
I guess just knowing the neighborhood that, there's concern about the
Yeah.
height restrictions already, and so many developments that have been allowed to go well beyond
Right.
height restrictions that have been set.
What's great about the north end is you've got a great cornice line. I mean, pretty much held the 55-foot standard, and those are things we need to look at as well as the historic context, the retrofitting, that we don't want to interfere with the neighborhood's urban context with these things. So that just requires further exploration. I mean, there's some suggestions that, do you vacate your first floor if it in the future is not livable, if you can't dry proof it? Well, would you allow that unit to be located on the top floor? I don't know how that would work under a condo association where the penthouse owner is no longer the penthouse owner, but it's not one size fits all. But we're talking modest elevation changes, not great 5 feet tops for these interventions.
But when you have that 3 or 4 feet for a rising tide, plus, of course, people have to put, or developers have to put mechanicals on the roof, it makes quite a difference in 11, 55 feet.
Right.
So we're also making open spaces. Sucking in the water.
Right. I mean, if you get these mechanisms in place, you don't have to worry about the elevation changes. Sorry.
Yeah, you mentioned, the Climate Ready Boston being a 2-year-old study, and then you mentioned other studies. Short term, that may not be permanent solutions, but it could be, solutions for next winter or the next, astronomical high tide. Is there information available? Is there help within the city in terms of engineering to help some of the condo associations do things that are sensible, that will work with DEP and, well, maybe not Army Corps of Engineers, but
I think there's
implement some of those things short
some
term?
flooding tips on the city's webpage, touching base with FEMA if you're in a current floodplain, on what you can do to dry proof your building. But there aren't any resources.
There's nothing to do with the climate ready workshop. I'm sure we can some
With that?
The environment department did do like climate ready workshops during their process, so I'm sure they still have some of those materials, so I could connect you with the environment department, and maybe if a condo association or a board wanted to sit down with one of the environment planners and kind of just look through the plan and get that can be done.
Yeah, sure.
You can ask your insurance companies. Sometimes insurance companies might give you a break on your rate or
Flood increase, yeah.
underwrite. If you do a flood assessment, so if you're a large complex, you could hire an engineering team just to do a vulnerability assessment where they go in and they're like, this is your area where you're most at risk. So that might be something, if you're part of a condo association or a larger area that you do that type of work. At least you understand where you're at risk now for flooding and come up with a plan. I don't know if you start dry proofing your building, you can get more rates out of the flood. What happens? even if you put in some protection.
I'm not sure.
I think I think it's all based on elevation. so.
It's flood zone.
Yeah.
We didn't get like a letter from that revision, actually, the way we mentioned, I think it was on the, when the flood zone is.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to this conversation something that, I'm sure you're looking at, but when you mentioned outer harbor barrier, and I think permanent wall was part of that, there was something less than a permanent wall, which I guess only addresses the storm surge, and that is what Venice is doing, which is something that's inflatable. And when the danger arises, before the danger arises, it's inflated and presents a barrier. I haven't looked into how that's working, but it's certainly something that I assume that your study is looking into. And the other thing I wanted to mention is something closer, which is New Bedford. New Bedford has a hurricane barrier that they built after the 1938 hurricane that closes off New Bedford Harbor when there is a forecast of a hurricane. And it has worked fine.
Providence has the same. And if you look at it, it's not just a barrier. You start going out along the edges, and it's a berm, a stone berm that cuts through neighborhoods. I don't know how they made the decision if it was inside or outside the berm. There's also, under the I-95 in New Bedford, there's floodgates that close. So there's a roadway that goes underneath it. So it's great engineering for something that occurred right after 1938. And then Galveston, Texas, that was hit by a hurricane in 1900. After that storm, they built a 9-foot seawall. They elevated every building, cathedrals, like massive homes, and pumped in, crap from the ocean that just filled in the land, which was really dramatic. I don't know if that might be a solution for Long Wharf, because Long Wharf is really vulnerable. It's washing out right now. That's a dramatic intervention by elevating an entire neighborhood.
And Marriott Hotel and State Street while you're at it.
Or maybe at least a custom house block in the chart house,
Rich, just a quick question. Just so I understand the level of risk we're talking about, is it safe to assume that the Seaport District in South Boston is within the future floodplain? Most if not all of it is within the future floodplain. And do you know what percentage of the new and recent development that's gone up there over the last several years is compliant with the city's new flood resistance requirements?
So most of those developments are elevated above this 40-inch risk.
So if someone were to come to the city today and propose those developments, they would pass muster?
Maybe that their mechanicals are protected, but their first floor is vulnerable. There's so many different areas where these projects were built. I think some of the older buildings are at risk, or at least the first floor is at risk. WS, which is building Seaport Square, in their plan had suggested kind of like disposable first floors. Their retail can absorb water, so the building materials don't get mold. I mean, that was the biggest problem in New York after Hurricane Sandy, is that you can go back to these buildings because of the mold, so that the building materials are saltwater tolerant, don't have mold or cause mold. And then also that the furnishings aren't heavy so that they become projectiles and break things. So what we've seen is like there's different elevations and different points where they may be vulnerable.
So the buildings may not be flood-proof, but they're flood-resistant. It's just that the city neglected to do the same to the streets around the building.
Well, this was never, I think in 2010, when we approved Seaport Square, there was one sentence that said that the developer shall comply with whatever floodplain policies the city have, or future sea level rise policies. We didn't have anything. And those streets were, that whole area was filled 100, 120 years ago. Those roads were just elevation. Because the wharf buildings, which was a huge component of that neighborhood, are at that elevation, so we just worked with what was at the elevation at the time. So that neighborhood's all on landfill and very vulnerable to flooding, future flooding. Yeah.
Is there a time frame within which you anticipate the study for the North End beginning and also being completed so that then some action can be taken?
I'm not sure when it's going to start. I know we're wrapping up South Boston this summer. So at the touch base with the Environment Department, you wrote that letter, right? But it was a pretty quick turnaround. We started South Boston last fall. We're wrapping it up this summer, so under a year. Under a year.
So do you think we'll start this summer?
What's that?
You'll start the study this
Oh,
summer?
I don't know. That's, I'm checking with the Environment Department.
Okay.
We'll have to keep harassing people.
We'll get into some.
I mean, the good thing, it probably moved so quickly because there was no developments, you know, there's nothing to fight over really. It's all good stuff. So, and we have really good engineering teams on both projects.
That'd be great. We get started before the season gets bad.
Absolutely. Let's get at it.
I'd like to say thank you very much. This is much appreciated, and